Hello and welcome to Climate Migration Explained, our fourth of 5 live explainers celebrating Yale Earth Week 2021. Based on our written article series called Yale Experts Explain, the purpose of these explainers is to break down complex, hot topics in sustainability using Yale's world-class expertise, thereby inviting everyone in the Yale community into conversations around climate change and how it affects them. Today, we'll have Yale College student Nora Massie interviewing Dr. Maya Prabhu, MD, LLB, and Associate Professor in the Division of Law and Psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. Now, we're going to get started in just a moment, but at the end of this conversation, if we have some time, we will be opening it up for Q&A with our expert. So as you're listening and getting inspired, I encourage everyone to add questions to the Q&A section of your screen as we go. If you have any tech questions, feel free to add them in the chat and my colleagues will help you out. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our incredible student interviewer and our Yale expert for Climate Migration Explained.
Hi everyone, I'm Nora. Happy Earth Day and Earth Week and Earth Month. Thank you so much for joining today. So I'm just going to start off by reading the Yale Office of Sustainability Statement of Inclusion, and then I'll introduce myself and Dr. Prabhu. The Yale Office of Sustainability recognizes that generations of Indigenous peoples and nations have stewarded the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and the land on which Yale's campus resides. We recognize that Indigenous values actively connect to our work, and we seek to learn more about those connections. We understand that the process will be ongoing, and we look forward to opportunities for collaboration. We ask that all participants consider their role in putting us on a pathway to right the wrongs of forced occupancy of land and the subjugation of others. You can find our full land acknowledgement in the chat, and you can also learn more about numerous Indigenous communities that have stewarded Connecticut's land. And then in the spirit of inclusion, we also want to remind the audience that live explainers are a neutral and safe space for asking questions and testing ideas. Please be open, listen honestly, and act mindfully. So again, I'm Nora Massie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a junior in Yale College. I am double majoring in English and environmental studies. I'm from New York City, and I'm really excited to be here today. So I'm talking with Dr. Maya Prabhu, MD, LLB. She is an associate professor in the Division of Law and Psychiatry, serves as a consulting forensic psychiatrist for the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. She has been a psychiatrist in the Yale New Haven Hospital Refugee Clinic and has extensive experience conducting forensic evaluations of refugees and asylum seekers. Her teaching and scholarship focuses on the intersection of mental health and displaced populations, climate change and mental health, and international legal instruments that advance health. She obtained her medical degree at Dalhousie School of Medicine and her law degree at McGill School of Law. She completed her adult psychiatry residency and forensic psychiatry training at Yale. And prior to her specialty training, she was an attorney with Davis, Polk, and Wardwell in New York and the United Nations Oil for Food Investigation. She has also worked with numerous international development agencies and organizations. So with that, I'm really excited to get this discussion about climate migration started. It's a topic that really interests me. But first, the first question here is just what do we mean when we say climate migration?
Well, hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Nice to see you again, Nora. We've chatted earlier in the week, and thank you all for coming. I'm really interested to hear your questions and to hear what people's thoughts are. So in answer to your question, the topic, so what do we mean by climate migration? So climate migration refers to people or communities or groups of people who move predominantly for reasons relating to changes in their environment due to climate change. So it could be a sudden change or it could be a progressive change, but individual people are obliged to leave their sort of habitual state of residence, their homes, or choose to do so. And it could occur in many forms. It could occur within borders, within their own states, which is actually how most climate migration change happens, or across borders. And it could be a permanent move, or it could be a temporary move. And I think it's just, I've got a moment more. What I will say is, look, humans are a migratory species. We are very mobile, and climate change and disasters have always been drivers of human mobility. Having said that, I think what we are trying to understand better is understanding how extreme weather-related events, such as floods and droughts and storms, as they become more frequent, as they become intense, as they cause changes in precipitation and temperature patterns, we know that they're going to impact livelihoods. We know that they're going to impact people's sense of securities. We know that they're going to impact people's places of abode. And we know that's going to drive population movement. And so that's what we're really focusing on today.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's super helpful to think about this as not a new phenomenon, as you're pointing out. Humans are a migratory species. And I guess my next question is kind of, you started to get at this, but about kind of this difference between internal displacement and cross-border migration, and how that relates to what we're talking about when we're talking about climate migration.
Yes, so I think, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, thinking about the stereotypes and myths that people have. People think about migrants, people always think about people coming over borders, but in fact, because climate change is really a subset of environmental migration, so people do move and have always moved because of changes in their environment and changes and the impact that environmental changes have had on their space. Very often environmental migration tends to happen a little bit more closer to home. So people stay within nation borders, or people engage in sort of seasonal changes. So they'll move into the cities in the off season for agriculture, and then they'll try to come back and return to more traditional or sustainable sort of livelihoods during the regular, say, for example, farming season or fishing season. And I think it's important because, in fact, we anticipate that sort of displacement related to climate events is most likely going to be internal, but we're also going to be seeing stresses across borders too, and that will be amplified by political situations, political conflicts, legal situations, where borders are, and how countries then are going to respond with sort of at the border and at the walls around their communities.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I think that this kind of gets into my next question, which is sort of about the difference between climate migrants and climate refugees. And I think that there is a lot of confusion about the term, climate refugee versus climate migrants. And I'm wondering if you can illuminate a little bit more, or talk a little bit more about what the term refugee means.
Sure. So you'll absolutely see the term climate refugee getting used, particularly sometimes in newspaper reports, although actually I think that the media has gotten more precise about that. But people even casually will speak about climate refugees. But I would actually advise, sort of caution people not to use the term sort of climate refugee. So the term refugee is what we call a term of art. It has a very specific meaning in international law. And it sort of harkens back to the 1951 Convention on Refugees, in which a refugee is very specifically defined as somebody who's unable to return to their home country because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted. And there's a number of criteria: persecution by on the grounds of race, religion, nationality. But it's a very specific legal category in legal category. And I think what I would say is, because with climate migration, context really matters. So the political definition, so what we call a political refugee, was very much created in the context after World War II, when we were thinking a lot about the ways that governments don't protect their peoples. And the term climate and thinking about environment just wasn't part of that definition at that time. So sometimes the question that I get is, well, why don't we just expand the Convention on Refugees to incorporate climate? Why don't we just add climate refugees to that understanding of it? And there are a lot of reasons not to, and international agencies and organizations that work with refugees, political refugees, are leery about that idea. But the particular concern is that political refugees have very specific rights and protections, and countries owe them certain obligations and protections. And the concern is that if we reopen that convention, that will actually end up eroding those protections for people. So rather, the focus at the regional, international levels is thinking about what new legal instruments can we do to protect people who are going to be, moving because of climate or environmental changes. And it isn't to say that climate refugees as people are going to say, use the term, or people who are climate migrants don't have rights at the current time. They ought to be protected by human rights and international human rights law. And there are sort of legal instruments that talk about the internally displaced persons and their rights. So people who are going to be migrating because of climate and environmental changes definitely have rights. But I think we'd try to stay away from the term climate refugee.
Thank you. That's definitely very helpful, and I think something that's not talked about enough. And kind of, I guess, on this topic of climate migrants, I think it's really interesting to think about the ways in which like our institutions and even legal definitions, as you're pointing out, are really not equipped to handle the 21st century challenges of climate, and the kind of way in which people move might be partially because of climate, but also for other reasons as well. And I think you and I have talked about how the reason why people move is often not just for one reason, it's for a lot of reasons, and climate might be one of those. But how do we incorporate that into our legal structure? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're raising the idea that migration is really multifactorial. Sometimes there's a dramatic event, a catastrophic event, a disaster, and people are forced to flee because their homes are getting flooded, the village is getting flooded, there's been an earthquake. And so, sort of thinking about those examples, we might think of those as what we call acute onset or fast acting events. So a hurricane, which levels a village, or a typhoon or a cyclone, which causes huge damage. To the extent that we can identify those as being related in terms of frequency and intensity to climate events, we can think of those as acute onset climate events. But some events also occur more slowly. Let's talk about rising sea levels, which might lead individuals to have and communities to have to move off of low-lying islands, or desertification, with communities having to move to places where they can actually plant crops or tend to herds of animals. So there are a lot of factors which contribute to people's decision to leave. People will follow in the paths of where other people from their community have gone. People follow along social networks. People go to where they might speak the same language. People go to cities with which they might be familiar, where they can get seasonal, sort of off-season work. So I think thinking about migration as being multifactorial is incredibly important. And I think it's also important to recognize that for all the people who may leave or be able to leave, there's very often people who can't leave. And we might call, and those are particularly vulnerable persons. Some of the literature might describe them as trapped, recognizing that while some people in a community might have the agency and ability to leave, some might not. And those are also people of concern, affected by climate, but unable to migrate if they wanted to.
Yeah, that's really important to point out, I think. And, I think we're going to talk a little bit later, but really early on, centering the fact that sometimes leaving and having the choice to migrate or to go somewhere else is a privilege. And yeah, so I think my next question is just sort of about giving some concrete examples of climate migration. Obviously, there's ones that have been super covered in the news, but can you just help us understand some global, national, or local examples of climate migration?
Of course. So we've talked a little bit about particular disaster events. So people having to leave after a hurricane, people having to leave after an earthquake, people leaving after a landslide because their homes and their villages and their places have been destroyed. We talked a little bit about people moving because of sort of flooding and waters rising. So it could be on a low-level island. So individuals, say, moving out of the South Pacific, and those countries having to think about what are we going to do with our populations in 20 or 30 years. But we've also sort of talked about thinking about people moving within states. So I think for a lot of Americans, particularly Hurricane Katrina was the first of many wake-up calls. I know about 1 million people moved out of the Gulf area after after there was intense flooding, and mostly they moved within the United States. So that's an example of sort of a displacement due to a singular event. But we've also had other cases that sort of had impacts here within Connecticut. There was a huge diaspora and exodus of individuals leaving Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and more recently Hurricane Irma, and they moved into the mainland United States. I think we're also going to see smaller moves. So people moving away from flood zones, moving away from the water to higher areas in order to sort of avoid being in the path of rising waters. And I think we're also beginning to see people moving away from zones that are going to get unbearably hot during the summer. So we're seeing migration away from parts of the South where the summer and the temperatures are going to get unlivable for many people, depending on what their particular vulnerabilities are, to cooler places and more north. Part of the challenge is that we can identify all these examples, but predicting where the stress points are going to be, and also sort of forecasting the numbers of people who might end up choosing to move or being forced to move is very hard.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. And I think we've also talked about in me and you and in some of my courses, the kind of secondary impacts that migration is causing. So for example, when you were talking about people moving from flood zones or from areas that are near the water, that tends to be wealthier white community families and communities who are then moving to lands at higher altitude, which have, you know, particular cultural and ethnic significance. For example, I think we've talked about Miami, where a lot of people are realizing that the sea level is rising and their homes on the beach are no longer really livable and won't be soon. And so they're moving into higher altitude areas such as Little Haiti, which has been a culturally significant area for a long time, and pushing people who have been there for a long time out and raising the rent and contributing to gentrification. So that's just one of those secondary examples that you and I have discussed that I think is really helpful in thinking about the ways in which the consequences of this are so far reaching and unpredictable.
Yeah, that's such a rich example. Can we unpack that a little bit? Because I think in that example, you're talking about people who are anticipating future risks and have the ability to move and either getting second houses or moving further inland. There's also a flip to like that. In some coastal areas, we have people, because they have the benefit insurance, because we choose to backstop insurance around flood insurance, may choose to stay and rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and that will have consequences too. But I think you're also sort of pointing out sort of the culture, the need to think ahead. And that's something that's very hard for municipalities and states to do, which is to do the long range infrastructure planning that is absolutely going to be needed. How do we create more housing? How do we create housing that people might only want to use at certain times of the year? How do we create basic infrastructure, meet basic infrastructure needs from water, electricity, Wi-Fi, which we also became so important during COVID? How do we think about enough space for schools, for kids? What do we do if we start seeing cycles of kids who are there only for part of the year? So that kind of planning is really challenging. And I think you've also sort of pulled out some of the cultural challenges as well, that as populations move in, either temporarily or permanently, it can be met with mixed emotion by the new hosting community. It can result in changes in their cost of living, changes in their cost of housing. It could feel like there's a cultural displacement. But also maybe thinking about that displacement issue from an international context for people who are communities that might feel forced to leave what they consider their ancestral home, who are leaving livelihoods that their parents and grandparents might have participated in, can also feel like a loss. So I think there's a lot of ways that cultural loss can be felt and experienced with this.
Yeah, I certainly. I totally, I think, yeah. So I think my next question is a little bit shifting gears, but is really about media portrayal of this phenomenon, and really thinking about how we can accurately reflect what's happening in the nuanced and complicated ways that we're talking about. So how do we tell stories in classrooms, in the media, even just in conversation, that describe the complexity of this issue and give justice to the people who are experiencing or living this phenomenon?
So I think your use of the word narrative is really important, because in every story, in every situation and displacement situation, there's going to be so many different narratives. There might be the narratives of the person who had to move. There might be the narratives of the community that is now going to be the host community and is having willingly or unwillingly to incorporate new persons temporarily or permanently. There's a lot of different narratives, and how do we bring compassion, a respect for human rights, and empathy to that? And I think it's worth noting that I think in general, migration stories and migrant stories can make people feel a little bit overwhelmed, particularly when many communities and many countries are already feeling under-resourced. Um, the idea of having to accommodate more people in some way can sometimes bring out the worst in our responses. We see human rights violations. We see denying of access, say, of healthcare workers or social services to sort of temporary settlements or temporary housing, and to the people living in them. So I think actually that media coverage of this issue has improved over the last few years. We're seeing more stories. We're seeing stories from around the world. We're seeing more nuanced stories, but there's always more stories to tell. And there's always more perspectives to have to highlight, and not just of vulnerable populations, but also about solutions and accommodations. We talked a little bit, you mentioned, what do we do for in classrooms? How do we help school-age kids or undergraduates or people sort of think about what a future might look like when there is climate migration? Although I should sort of point out, climate migration is already here. We're already seeing it in many ways. And I had to think about if what are the main things that I want people to take away. Well, I think the first is to be aware of always the dangers of othering, right? Seeing the migrant as an interloper, as an intruder, somebody who's going to take away resources, somebody who's going to tax the system. So I think being very attuned to sometimes the very racialized language that occurs around migrants is incredibly important. And to sort of recognize that the other piece of the narrative I wish that we heard more from is this idea that people have always moved. People have always gone to different places for work and for home. People have gone to different places for school. I bet if we were to ask the people who are listening, how many of them were born in the same place that their parents were born, or how many of them are now sitting in the same place that they were born, I think we'd hear a lot of stories about journeys taken. And to recognize that therefore these journeys are not exceptional, but sort of part of normal social and human experience. So I think normalizing mobility is incredibly important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think part of normalizing mobility is creating the infrastructure and institutions to support mobility, which leads into my next question, which is you can talk about global or national or local, even your own experience with systems or organizations or institutions that do exist to support climate migrants. If you could give us a sense of what those are, and also what systems or institutions are currently lacking to support climate migrants.
So I think the most important international organizations are going to be UNHCR and IOM and their partner agencies. So the international agencies that are particularly tasked with thinking about vulnerable populations and displaced populations, because I think they have a wealth of understanding, information about the complexities and the of migration, how it intersects with the classic migration story refugee story that we think about, which might involve political violence or political persecution. So I think the international agencies are keenly aware of the multifactorial nature of migration, and thinking about how to meet the needs of displaced populations. I think in the United States, we have a very well-developed system of refugee resettlement programs, which help welcome and incorporate and integrate political refugees into this country. And I fully anticipate that going forward, they may think about their task more broadly. How are we going to be dealing with people who are moving sort of more irregularly? Not to confuse political migrants with climate migrants, but to recognize that displacement is going to be the key theme here rather than the reasons. And I have to say there's been a wealth of academic research on this, including at Yale, including elsewhere, people wanting to understand all aspects of climate migration. How can we forecast it? What are the specific health needs? How do we create sustainable modular homes and housing so that to sort of meet temporary needs? How do we help people integrate? How do we build infrastructures that are can be scaled up or scaled down as necessary? So I think there's a wealth of both research and interest in it. And I think the biggest challenge in the gap is planning. It's always easy to respond to a crisis. It's always easiest to deal with something that's immediately in front of you. It's really hard for political organizations, for governments at any level to think about events that are unfolding slowly and that they'll have to plan for 5, 10, and 15 years out.
Definitely. I think that climate is showing that we really have a reactive rather than proactive sort of system and approach to crises. And getting towards my last few questions, you mentioned some academic research that's happening in Israel. And here we are at Yale, and I know we've also talked about significant migration of Puerto Rican people to New Haven. So I can't help but ask, is there a place for Yale in addressing this issue? And is Yale already doing stuff to address this issue? What could it be doing better?
So I am very happy to say there is a lot of research being done by people across disciplines into the community experience and developing community collaborations that are both led by and guided by the interests of the communities. So I particularly interested and focused around climate and health and public health. And there are many groups of researchers who are trying to understand the impact of the mental health impacts, for example, or the social and health needs of people who've been displaced. I think one of the challenges is always working with communities, not just in real time, because I think we do a good job at trying to reach out to those communities, but trying to work with communities in anticipation of future needs. How do we work with communities at the planning stage? Again, because it's a lot easier to solve a problem that's in front of us than to begin to anticipate a problem that might fully emerge fully out. But I think a few things. I think one of the great benefits of Yale is that we've got people in the faculty, among students who are from many places, and who are interested in doing work in many places. So I think ultimately even these research and academic collaborations are built around personal relationships and people bringing their personal experiences into the discourse, into the research discourse, into the teaching discourse. So I'm optimistic that we have a wealth of interested people and insight, and people who want to work together too.
Yeah, I agree. And as a student, I'm also optimistic about the number of students who are committed to holding Yale accountable for its responsibility to both the local and the global community. So my last question, just quickly, it's impossible not to talk about COVID-19. It's been kind of the main thing on everybody's mind for the past year and a half now. So what intersections do you see climate migration having with global health, and has COVID-19 shed any further light on this intersection?
Thank you. The dual challenges, right? Dual pandemics, mental health and COVID and health. So I think COVID has reminded of us of how challenging it can be to provide healthcare and access to healthcare for persons who are living sort of irregularly, and to the fact that we attach health access to healthcare or health insurance to people's employment statuses or national statuses really limits us when people are forced to flee, leave their jobs or leave their homes or flee across the border. I mean, I think the fact that, so migrants often find themselves living in what we call irregular living situations. So they find themselves living in settlements or in camps or living in very crowded homes wherever they can find them. There are people who might not have access to healthcare systems. So under these circumstances, how do you ensure that people can engage in basic public health care? So basic best practices. How do you ensure for social distancing? How do you get masks to people? How do you, if people don't have access to running water and soap and disinfectant products, how do we keep people safe? And I think COVID has really highlighted the health needs and the social needs and the social challenges of migrant populations. And of course, unfortunately, we saw really terrible human rights violations of many migrants, say workers who were literally trapped into their places of work and couldn't leave, or people who were forced to leave maybe safer places and go back to really vulnerable communities that were already taxed. And stay-at-home orders made it really challenging for people to access healthcare if they needed them, or for healthcare to get to them. So I think we've all experienced and seeing the fraying of a lot of infrastructures, and I think we're going to have to think about how to bolster those. I think so. I'll wait for the questions.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. I think we're going to move into questions now.
That we are. So first of all, thank you to both of you for this amazingly thoughtful and dynamic conversation. Now that we're moving into the Q&A, I'm just going to send another reminder, pop your Q&A into the chat, rather your questions into the Q&A portion of the chat, and I'll be sending them to Nora so that she can read them to Dr. Prabhu directly.
Okay, so the first question we have is, when it comes to preparing for climate migration, what are the top things you would recommend to today's urban planning students and professionals who will be planning cities of the future?
Oh, great question. Thank you. I didn't get a chance to sort of note that a lot of climate migration is going to be people moving from coastal areas or agricultural areas into cities to look for work, sometimes temporarily and sometimes permanently. So I think this question about housing and infrastructure is going to be key. And what are we going to be doing for, how do we create housing that both allows us to perhaps socially distance for the inevitable future pandemics or infectious disease concerns that that will develop as we see changes in the environment and likely changes in kind of infectious disease patterns. So housing is going to be absolutely critical. Access to sort of water infrastructure, access to technology infrastructures. One of the things that I'm not the only person who's thought about this, that imagine if COVID had happened 10 years ago, before we had easy access to Zoom, to platforms, to digital platforms. We've relied so much on technology to give us workaround solutions. But for many individuals who are migrants, whether they're climate migrants or political migrants or any other type, they didn't have access to that technology. So we counted on sort of IT to solve many problems, but that is not even a solution that's accessible to many people. So thinking about that technology grid is going to be incredibly important.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. The next question we have is, migration can be very political. What would you recommend for having conversations with and others about climate migration without things getting heated?
Well, I have to say that I think many of us, it seems like in our entire community, many societies are at the end of their temper and patience after a very long, challenging year dealing with the pandemic. So I have to sort of acknowledge that it seems hard to have any conversation nowadays without it getting political and heated. But I appreciate the idea that the only way to plan for the future, the only way to deal with complex problems is if we can move things to a place where we're talking about facts and we're thinking about how to be constructive. I think one of the biggest challenges is that people get anxious about resources, right? People get anxious when they feel like there's not enough housing they can afford, when they feel like there's not enough space in the school system for their kids, when they feel like there's not enough water. People are protective of their own resources. And I think that's understandable. I think that we can see when people are fearful, they kind of hunker down. So I think we kind of have to recognize that a lot of the politicization of this comes from people feeling fearful and insecure about their own futures. So I think one way to reframe the conversation is to again come back to the idea that what we're seeing is not an entirely new phenomenon. People have always moved because of environmental or disaster pushes. And that while we anticipate more of that in the future as we see climate intensity, we also have the ability to plan for it. We can think about solutions that think about housing. We can think about how to meet people's needs. I think thinking about access to healthcare in an entirely different way as a human right, not just an employment benefit, could be really critical. So I think changing the idea to making the pie and the resources available to everyone can be a way of not having people think that it's a trade-off between meeting their own needs and meeting outsider needs. I think another piece of this is when people think of migrants, they think of outsiders. They think of things happening to other people, often in faraway places. They think of desperate people who are destitute, fleeing terrible situations, which is indeed the case for many millions of people. But climate migration is going to affect everybody. Climate migration is already here, and we're already making choices about how we're going to accommodate and respond to changing climate conditions. And so recognizing that it's going to affect all of us and not just others and outsiders, trying to find a basis for empathy, I think is a way to have that conversation.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone who continues to ask questions. The next question is, do you see any good examples of cities or countries managing climate migration that we may use as a model?
So I actually think that the very fact that just this week, in this week's United States climate is having a climate sort of summit, that recognizing climate migration is explicitly on the summit is incredibly important. Naming the problem is incredibly important. Again, anticipating that we're going to be creative about how we think about legal basis for staying, how we think about employment, how we think about accommodation in advance is important. You know, there have been discussions in the past about, so New Zealand for a period of time had sort of trialed the idea of climate visas to think about how to accommodate Pacific Islanders who were going to have to move because of rising floodwaters. And I think that was an example of trying to think about visa statuses and legal statuses to make moving because of climate thinking about legal basis for staying is really important. That particular scheme doesn't exist and it is not ongoing. But I think thinking about political, national and regional solutions to a predictable problem, foreseeable problem, is the way to do it, rather than sort of responding in crises. There have been efforts at the international level to discuss climate migration, to think about solutions. The Global Compact on Migration, again, incorporates language and concerns about climate migration. So there are discussions that are going to have, there are spaces that are being created to have those discussions. But frankly, of course, COVID made it really difficult to begin to have those discussions. But we will return to them. So.
Great. I think again, great question. The next question that we have, and we're running out of time, so I am sorry if we don't get to everyone's question. This I think is going to be the last question. Topics like climate migration can be very stressful and anxiety inducing for people working in the environmental space. What recommendations do you have for climate students and professionals to tend to their mental health while dealing with issues like climate migration that are affecting lives worldwide?
Oh, thank you so much for this question. To think about how do we do this work sustainably and how do we think about mental health? So I wonder if the questioner is sort of referring to a concept that sort of there's small literature around called sort of eco distress. And like eco distress can take sort of many forms. It can be the anxiety that people have, but feeling helpless in the face of climate changes. It can encompass the idea that people are feeling are seeing climate changes taking place around them and feeling the loss. People anticipating, people will say things like, I don't want to live in a world without polar bears or secular flora or fauna. I don't want to live in a world that feels degraded. So it's anxiety about the future. And I also want to throw in this concept that sometimes eco distress can take the form of a real loss, the loss that people who have been forced to move or have been displaced have about having to leave places that are incredibly culturally important to them or have heritage importance to them. And my answer to that is actually community and action. I think when people feel the most helpless and the most distressed is when they're struggling to find something to do. And the antidote to that distress is finding a community that you want to work with, that engages your skills and your particular interests, and beginning to take some steps, whether you're taking steps around educating people around you, whether you're collaborating with people around a project, even though it might feel small and you realize it'll take more time than you would like it to. I think action and community are the antidotes to the anxiety that we all feel about what the future is going to look like. And I take a great deal of I find the fact that we've got a generation that is so enthusiastic about these issues and so concerned about the future. I actually find that a cause of sort of hope and enthusiasm. If you just thought about the problem as it is easy to become overwhelmed and to feel despairing. But realizing that there are many people who want to work on these issues and will chip away at it is, for me, an incredible source of solace.
Thank you. Thank you so much again. I think that Dr. Prabhu is a source of inspiration for all of us, certainly for me, and I'm really happy to have been a part of this conversation.
Thank you for asking such good questions, everyone. Thank you for being interested.
We are now right at time. So on behalf of Yale Sustainability, Dr. Prabhu, I extend my thanks to you for sharing your expertise today, and also to Nora for being such an amazing conversationalist and really inviting the community to explore this topic. Now, to our audience members, if you loved this conversation, we have one more on sustainable fashion tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our very last day of Earth Week. As Nora mentioned, of course, this is Earth Month, so the fun doesn't have to stop here. Feel free to register on our website and to explore our calendar of events and our library of opportunities for learning and action on our site, which is earthweek.yale.edu, which Scott has already popped in the chat, so thank you for that. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.